Hi, and welcome to the Triton T1 Live Foil Tech Talk. Hope everybody can hear me just fine. If you can't hear me, drop a message below, and I'll give it a couple of seconds for people to join up. And the first thing we're going to actually do is, before I get into anything else, I will play the video that some of you have already been watching if you've been in the queue, just to show you some action that I have on the Triton. And then we'll get into the full live stream. Enjoy the video. All right, I hope everybody enjoyed that little video, and let's start. Well, here it is. This is a Triton T1 monofoil, and if you're here, you obviously probably know what monofoil is all about, but just in case we've got people watching who don't really know what monofoiling is all about, it is essentially having, instead of having a normal glider with a front wing and a stabilizer, we now have basically a single wing. But for example, the difference between a monofoil and between a stabless foil would be like people have been cutting off their stabilizers or riding without a stabilizers for quite a while. That is not the same as a monofoil. A monofoil, or basically a single wing sort of plane, does have elements built into it to replace the stabilizer. Whereas if you just cut the stabilizer off your foil and ride stabless, then it will ride slightly differently. When you're riding stabless, certain front wings work better and are more stable doing that, and some are not so good for that. And I'll get into that later when I'm explaining a little bit about the monofoil in itself and how it works. So, first of all, well, here is the Triton T1. The whole backstory of me trying this is a couple of months ago, Chris from Triton got in touch with me and asked me if I would be willing to test it and then to talk about it on the channel. And obviously said yes. Monofoiling is something that's not completely new to me. Actually, the second foil that we built here on Forteventura for my old company, Magma, was actually first experiment with the monofoil. And it sort of worked, but it wasn't good enough, or let's say I wasn't good enough to really appreciate writing it back then. It was also a very rough thing. I just basically took some concepts when I designed it from single wing planes, and well, it didn't really work so well, so we abandoned it back then. Nowadays, we know a lot more about foiling, so especially the guys from Triton have put quite a lot of work into this to make it work. Now, I've spent quite some time writing foils stabless, sometimes by accident, but a lot of times just testing out different front wings, because a good way to see how a front wing works is actually to ride it without a stabilizer. You can see if you've got your angle of attack set up properly, and just in general how a front wing will work. Certain front wings have quite a decent amount of reflex in their profiles, which work actually quite well as a stabless foil, and others which are very flat profile, don't really have any reflex. They're a lot harder to ride. So just in general, riding stabless is actually quite feasible and possible. There's quite a few riders that do that. Probably famous of all of these is probably Øyvind Nostal, is a Norwegian guy. You've probably seen some really funny videos from him where he's riding stabless. He's also riding stabless when he's winging. And the advantage of not having a stabilizer, it gives you a very sort of tight turn. You don't have anything resisting this, the turning of your front wing. Now, however, a normal plane or foil needs the stabilizer to negate the pitching moment of the front wing. Any front wing, as it's sort of flying along, will eventually get to a speed where the profile or the wing actually will just sort of start pitching forward. And as that's happening, if you're foiling, you're going to have to start putting more and more pressure on your back foot to try to keep the nose up. But eventually, that pitching moment's going to win out over what you can do or reposition your foot, and it's just going to nosedive. And the stabilizer is essentially regulating that and preventing it from nosediving. So the issue with riding stabless is it's super fun, typically at lower speeds, but at a certain speed, it's really hard to keep the foil under control, to keep its pitch moment from basically just pitching down and making it impossible to ride. So if you see a lot of guys who have been riding stabless, I mean, there's enough videos out there, you will see that they are going fairly slow. They're doing like the nice little freestyle moves. They're doing like tight little spins, and they're riding on the waves a little bit, but you won't see them riding at decent speeds. Now, this is where a monofoil works really well, because the monofoil, if you look at it, especially towards the back, you'll see quite a lot of reflex here on the back of the wing. This is essentially also the way the profiles are set up on a single wing or a monofoil, are there to replace the stabilizer so that the pitching moment is sort of negated and you will find a balance point. And the good part of that is when it's stable, because you don't have a long fuselage, you have very tight turning. So imagine basically standing on like a balance board where you can actually sort of spin the board around. There's nothing resisting it to it. Now, if you watch the video, you can see that I've actually been going pretty fast. That is the number one thing about monofoils that has been a problem before, and also with riding stabless, you can't go very fast because you typically lose control. And actually, my expectation, I'm the eternal pessimist here when I'm testing new things, was all right, this is going to be fairly difficult to get used to and to ride if you've been used to riding normal foils. So getting up and riding and going, I thought, okay, it's going to be a bit difficult, but I should be able to manage. I've ridden stuff like this before. But I was quite surprised. It actually rode more or less normal in a straight line. And that's actually surprising for me. This is the first monofoil I've ridden, which feels super pitch stable no matter what the speed. So I'm able to push it at higher speeds and just basically jumping takeoff speeds. And I never had an issue where I felt that it was pitching down. So before I go farther, let's talk a little bit about some technical details. So just all in all, the entire system altogether, basically the wing and the mast, which is the aluminum mast that TRITON sent me. This is like an 85. In full measurements, actually, this one is 86. Altogether mast and the wing is 2.98 kilograms. So just under 3 kilograms, which is a fairly decent weight for something this size with an aluminum mast. Probably if they ever make a carbon mast, they should be able to save some weight on there. Obviously, you're not going to make something like this too light. You don't want something that will fall apart. So just under 3 kilos. That's more in line if you look at fairly big sab foils or most of the other carbon foils. You are sort of in that range. It's slightly heavier. Remember, it's an aluminum plate and an aluminum mast. So that's where you get the weight. The wingspan is basically from here to here. That is just about 60, and there's about 45 front to back. You'll notice it has a very unique shape. Yep. It has fairly square edges. The leading edge is actually fully squared all the way around. But the cool thing here, you don't really have any super sharp edges on here that you can cut yourself with. So I would consider this a very safe foil to use. Now the connection system is a little bit different. If you look at it here, we have one elongated hole right here and one other M8 countersunk hole there. And that sort of works on the counterpoint here. We just unscrew a little bit and I can show you the system as it is on here. So when you're setting this thing up, you just have the two M8 screws. As you can see, there is a pin right in the center here. Right? And that basically locks into that center piece. I'm actually going to take it apart fully and then set it up. Barry Ritchie, yeah, I understand. That is a thing that people have complained about big wings in foiling for a while. That people don't like the fact that the wing has volume and it floats. I personally find that makes it easy, especially when doing strapless starts. But if that is a deal breaker for you, yep, I understand that. There is usually with the other foils that have a lot of volume, I've had the foil sail upwind after a crash, whereas I haven't had that yet with the Triton. I haven't had one of those it taking off upwind with the foil on the surface. So you might want to still give it a chance on that because I don't think it has the same issues as, for example, like a Sapfoil 633, where I have had them sailing upwind and I've had to body drag after them quite fast. So, all right, just putting the foil together here. There is actually a little sort of washer profile that goes on here. That's sort of going to protect the carbon and so on. Just a little extra thing. So that sort of slots in here. So when that's in, you have this little washer here that goes in there like that. Two screws go in, and then you screw it all together. Yeah, it doesn't take very long to set up this foil. Now you're probably wondering, why would they have this elongated hole? Yeah. Well, that's actually pretty good for compatibility, because I've actually made this bottom part work with my Project Cedrus mast. I've made it work with the Sapfoil mast. I've made it work with the North mast. Yeah, so I've made it almost every mast I've had here, with the exception of the old Sapfoil mast with the M6. They all fit on this well. You just basically, if you have a mast that has an M8 screw system, more than likely it will actually be compatible here. That said, Chris has told me basically when it's set up like that, as you don't have that pin, that locking pin in there, you shouldn't really be jumping it. Okay, and I understand that, because without that locking pin, you still have quite a lot of forces, especially on the roll axis, which you could damage the foil if you don't use the actual mast that's delivered with it. The aluminum mast by itself weighs 1.78 kilos, so it's fairly heavy. It's aluminum. It is, however, quite a thin profile, so it's still quite a fast mast. Now, if for super heavy riders and if you're doing wing freestyle, I wouldn't recommend jumping a mast that is this thin, made out of aluminum. It's and just in my experience, they will not tend to last in that. But I'm assuming they'll eventually come up with a thicker mast, especially for those guys who are eventually going to start wing foiling, freestyling with it. But for kiting, that mast is more than enough. You saw I was jumping around with it, and that was fine. I mean, I weigh, actually in the video, I was at my height of my weight, I was about 88 kilos. And I had actually nothing breaking on here. The T1 is actually fairly durable. I had a few little ground contacts. This is almost unavoidable here at Flag Beach. Just a few little scuffs and markings, and it all held together really well. So, if we get to some of the questions that you guys sent me per email, I've got some questions from Thilo Bayerhofer here. So he's asking, what is the ideal board volume if you're a proficient kite foiler? So in my opinion, volume is actually not that important. If you're a proficient kite foiler, you're going to use the same board that you have been using up until now with a normal foil. You don't need to have more or less volume. That said, in the beginning, you probably might want to at least go out with more than enough wind. I wouldn't go out super underpowered before, like, knowing how it rides. You should take a little bit more power out there with you, just to make things easy so you get used to how it rides. So that will sort of bring me a little bit how to my very first experience on the T1. As I said before, my first experiences with monofoiling and stabless foiling have always been they're fairly twitchy to ride. It takes some time to get used to them. And to my big surprise, the T1 was not like that. I got up, I could ride in a straight line immediately. It wasn't different. I pretty much went for broke. I went strapless first of all, and I put the mast all the way forward in the tracks, just sort of trying to line up where I thought it would be needed. I could always typically I try to when I'm testing a new foil, I don't know where it goes. I'll put it all the way forward and go strapless, and if it's too much, I'll just stand farther forward on the board and then sort it out accordingly. But the most forward position on the board I was riding, which is a North Scoop Mini, it's 110 in length. That actually worked really good in the forward position, and I didn't have any issues with it. So just getting up and riding in a straight line was easy, and I was immediately surprised about how pitch stable it was. I was just waiting for that initial sort of dive to start happening where it just starts to lose front foot pressure and will start going, and it actually doesn't do that. What it also doesn't do, which is quite surprising, it doesn't start progressively powering up your front foot as you're going faster. It sort of just seems to find a like balanced level flight, and it just sort of holds that, and it doesn't sort of tend to overpower you a lot. I would like to say that you'll see it in the video anyway. I've got a fairly wide stance on that board, and I normally don't ride that wide stance with the other foils I ride. I sort of have my front foot actually in the right position for the board. I tend to always try to position my front foot regardless of the foil position. Actually, I will position it so that the board's rocker line works the best to have the best chance of taking off. That's a whole different subject, which I'll actually be going into on one of my other channels, which is called the Hydrofoil.wtf. Ooh, thanks for the donation, Goofy Regular. But essentially, if you can set up your board with your feet positioned so that the board is working well to take off without the foil, it'll obviously work better with the foil. So my front foot, it was in the same position I always ride with it at, but my back foot, I was standing a lot farther back, and it felt a lot more comfortable having that wider stance with this. Also, for me, it was much easier to ride the T1 with straps. Riding it strapless, I found it a little bit difficult to really get the most out of it, to get those tight turns, to get those sort of spinny 180s in there. Landing ollies was almost impossible for me in the beginning with me riding strapless. And maneuvers for me, like doing fast maneuvers, I just felt a lot more locked in on the board with the straps, and it made me feel a bit more confident. I was riding it strapless for quite some time. I sort of like half the time I was riding strapless, half the time strapped. By no means is it really hard to ride it strapless. It just, I feel that to get the most out of it for me, straps were the way to go. The thing that I found difficult in the beginning for the first sort of 10-15 minutes of riding was getting the right timing for the jibes. Now, that is a typical thing actually with almost any sort of monofoil, stabless foil, or actually even foils where you have a really short fuselage. If you're used to having a bit more stability from a stabilizer, your timing changes and how you can trust and the foil to stay up. So the best way to explain this is if I have a very long fuselage, just imagine that standing on a very sort of large board, like if you've got a displacement board, you're standing on that, and it doesn't sort of want to roll or pitch around. Now, the shorter you make that board, it's gonna basically be a lot twitchier and more pitchy, but it'll also be more maneuverable. And the same thing happens exactly the same with short fuselage foils, and especially stabless or monofoils. Because you don't have that fuselage and you have this very short, like again, it's 45 centimeters in total length, it obviously reacts very fast to your shifts in weight. So in maneuvers, you have to be much more sensitive to where you place your foot, especially when being strapless. With straps, you're always going to put your front foot in the same place during a jibe or tack. Whereas strapless, you tend to like be a centimeter off here or there, and where a foil with a larger fuselage will sort of stay up and it won't react to that as fast. A monofoil reacts, and the T1 is no exception to that. It reacts slower than, for example, a stabless foil. If you get it slightly wrong on a stabless foil, it's gone. It'll immediately dive, and that's it. You have to really actually sort of keep some pressure on your back foot. Here I found I could still do more or less a normal foot switch, but I needed to be more exact of where I put my foot, and I felt I needed a bit more speed and help from the kite. But after about 10 minutes, I got the timing right, and then it was actually quite easy. And also, it's something you have to learn to trust, because in the beginning, having all that maneuverability, it sort of scares you. It feels different. Usually, when your foil does that sort of quick turn, it's something you're not used to, and you'll typically go, "Oh my god, I'm just going to kick the foil away and crash." You just have to go through that and then actually push through it. And the T1 actually really allows you a really tight, fast turn, really aggressive turn. But it takes a little bit of time of trusting it, because a normal foil, if it sort of gives you that feedback of sort of just getting really like tight on the turn, you're like, no, I've turned too tight, I'm gonna crash, and you tend to bail when that happens. But after you do that 3 or 4 times, you realize that, oh, I can actually push it through. And another thing that wasn't expecting the T1 to do really well was deal with breaches, because just in my experience, if you have like a really sort of fat tip shape like this, where you have quite a lot of cord here, they tend to not like breaching. They will basically breach, suck air, and then you'll crash. And the T1, actually, small breaches you'd hardly notice at all. And if you have pressure on your back foot, you can just basically slam it through a jibe or 360 or anything where the foil's on the surface, and it will just go through. If you, however, like, if it happens to your first time and you're used to the foil, basically spinning out, yeah, you'll tend to kick it away. But once you learn to trust that, oh, it sucked air, but I don't care about it, it'll go through. If you're used to riding like modern high aspect racing style foils, which are also not very sensitive to tip breaches, you'll already know how to deal with if you basically come out of the water with it. Now, another cool thing the T1 can do, which is typically something you are used to using like very, very thick profiled surf foils, is you can skim it on the water. So you can basically go all the way to the surface, and once you breach out of the water completely, you can actually sort of skim the thing like a boat on top of the water, which allows for like cool little sliding tricks and so on. So that's actually quite fun. The whole fun part of this type of foil is to do things you cannot do with a real foil. So one of the pros obviously is that super fast turning, that being able to slide on the top of the water and doing that. Does it ride well with the hand wing? Kevin Opar's asking. I will get to that in a couple of minutes. I'm just gonna talk about the little bit about the essentially wave riding capabilities of this with the kite. So it turns really, really tight, so that makes it super fun on waves with a kite. When you find a decent sized wave, you go down that, you can really rip your bottom turn, really cut back really hard, and so on. Once you've found that trust for the foil. What you can't expect from it is that it's as glidey as a sort of glidered foil. Like if you compare it to anything sort of like modern out there, like the sort of the mid-high aspect surf foils nowadays, it doesn't have that same type of glide. It likes to stay fast, and if you keep your turns tight, you will stay on the wave and you won't need so much power in your kite or your wing. But those slow, drawn out turns, it's not quite so good at that. It is what it is. It isn't a super high aspect glidey foil, so you shouldn't expect that it would ride like that. But the thing is, it doesn't ride like a super low aspect foil either. And here's the thing, it looks super low aspect, and if you probably calculate it, it's somewhere in like the 2.8, I would imagine somewhere. I actually haven't done the math, my bad. But it actually has the speed and the glide of something just a little bit more towards the medium aspect foils. So let's get a little bit on to then winging, because that's the third question that I got in the email, and also what Kevin is asking. Does it ride well with a hand wing? Yes, as long as you're powered. You got to accept that it is a fairly small foil. Now, Triton and some other people have basically said that they would compare it to 1,200 square centimeter foil, like standard foil. Now, most people who know me will realize I hate using surface area as a metric for comparing foils. To me, surface area means absolutely nothing when comparing low end and high end for the foils. It is so different between all the foils. And that's this exact same case here. The whole sort of starting behavior of the T1 lends itself really well to kiting. And you can get it going with a kite in super low winds as long as you have a decent amount of skill and power in the kite. Now, here's the thing. A normal foil, when you're actually starting, it will reach a certain takeoff speed and then just sort of start rising by itself without too much input from you. The T1 likes a little bit more input, especially in lighter winds. So in light winds, you can basically push it up and get it flying very quickly if you have the skills. What it doesn't like is sort of a light, like an overly heavy foot. So if you're used to like on a big glider foil, something like 1,500, 1,200 medium aspect foil, which will come up, and if you push really hard on your front foot, that it will level out and fly. This won't do that. You have to be really sensitive. This is like riding a really small high aspect foil in this respect. So in really light wind, where you don't quite have that takeoff speed, if you force it up and you push too hard on your front foot, there's nothing here to resist that. So it will come down very quickly and you'll sort of start dolphining. You got to get used to coming up, and then as soon as you start to rise, flattening off again without over pressuring your front foot so you don't dive it. And if you have that skill set, super easy. If you don't, you'll get used to it after a while. It's essentially just like if you're switching down from a large foil to a really small high aspect front wing, you'll have that same issue. Now, when winging, this can pose a little bit of a different scenario. With winging, we don't have so much of this power spike that we can generate with a kite. You know, I got this going in about 6 knots with a 7 meter kite. Now, that's not going to be possible with a wing. I've got really powerful hand wings. They're coming out from north in a couple of weeks, I think. It's not the same. So with the 7 meter kite, I could loop 2 or 3 times and pump, and I'd eventually get enough board speed to get the T1 flying, and that was easy. And then after a while, just with 1 or 2 loops, I didn't even have to pump that hard. I just set the angle like really hard. I push on my back foot, get the thing up in the air, flatten it out, and I'd be going. Now, with the wing, we don't have that option. With the wing, we do almost everything by generating forward momentum with the wing, there's almost no lift straight up that we can just sort of force the foil to fly. And now this is where I felt that this needed a lot more power in the wing or more board speed than your normal like 1200 medium aspect or high aspect ratio wing foil wing, with the glider, because those have a just different safer takeoff thing, and they just need a little bit less actual straight speed, because again, there's nothing yanking us up out of the water when winging. Once I got the enough takeoff speed, it was fine. So most of the time I was riding this with a wing in winds above 15 knots, and then with in 15 knots being the lower range I would consider for my weight and this foil. I was like on 5.5, very powerful wing, and okay, it takes also longer distance on the water to take off. The T1 doesn't sort of have this tendency to like to feel like it's gonna like immediately pop up. It really, you get that board speed first, and then you have to figure out the angle a little bit, and then it will start to go up, and then it'll just poof, it'll be up, and then you got the control, and you're like, oh, okay, I'm flying, and it's great. And once it's up, it's actually really good because it's fast. This brings me to Good Morning's question. How fast is it compared to a medium aspect foil? It depends which medium aspect foil we're talking about. There's a lot of variants out there with different profiles, but it's fast. It is a lot faster than you would think from a foil of this size, and it's definitely faster than a lot of the other similar sized medium aspect foils on the market. There are some which are faster. I mean, we've got Francesco Capuzzo, who is winning races, international competition races on the medium aspect RRD foil. And that's really fast because it has a fairly thin and fast profile, whereas a lot of the medium aspect foils are set more towards sort of like the beginner freeride market, and they have thicker foils, and they're obviously not as fast. But this is really fast, especially considering how big it is. Now, for staying on the winging thing for now, maneuvers, because it doesn't quite have that sort of pitch resistance to you, it's a bit more difficult. You have to be a lot faster on your foot switch if you're going for a maneuver on a wing foil. And you have to be a lot more sort of committed. So if you try to go for a very large radius turn and you're going to lose board speed, it's probably going to lose lift, and it's going to touch down. You need to keep that speed in there. It's not a high aspect lifty foil. So for example, if I would take 1100, 1200 high aspect foil, I can actually slow down, and then I can sort of just use that glide it has to kick and pump on, because it's very efficient. This doesn't quite have that. In that respect, it sort of behaves more like a medium or lower aspect foil. You can pump it, but it doesn't sort of recover from a complete stall if you do that on a wing, like a high aspect foil would. But on a kite, it actually behaves differently. On a kite, you can pretty much come to a dead stop, and as long as you have just the kite still flying, you can still do a small loop or a small redirect with the kite, and just basically just kick it around, and it will sort of just keep going. But this is not something you can do with a wing. At least I haven't figured out how to do it with the wing yet, of doing like a stop and then re-engaging without actually using power from the wing. If you have the wing in your hand, yeah, you can do the same thing. You can basically do a slide turn, almost come to a stop, re-engage the wing, and then keep going. But for example, if you're surfing on the wave and you lose the wave a little bit, if you don't recover the wing quick enough, you will basically you won't be able to recover from a full stop. Now, stability in the wave when winging, it's actually really good. Yeah, like I said, the pitch stability is really, really nice. And having that sort of really quick turning is super, super fun. It opens up a whole new ball game, especially in like sort of small to mid-size waves, sort of up to shoulder high. They're not really breaking hollow. You can really slam the foil around. Where I found it a bit more difficult was actually really sort of big rolling swells. I found that it has the speed, but it doesn't quite have that efficiency of making it easy. You can ride the swells, but it's not going to be the same as a larger high aspect foil that you could use for like downwinding typically. Um, but again, I don't think it's made for that. I mean, I've had quite a long discussion with Chris about it. That I mean, this thing was never made for wing foiling. I mean, it works for it, but it takes a decent amount of skill to actually get the most out of it. And if you're gonna try this wing foiling, definitely do not go underpowered. And whatever you do, don't use like the last year style boards with those massive double concaves and kicktails and cutouts and whatnot at the bottom, which slow your board speed down. This foil really needs a good amount of board speed to engage when you're wing foiling. So you want a really efficient board to do that, and yeah, that'll make life easier. But again, go powered. Don't go underpowered for your first session. All right, Steve Follis, our resident protege racer here. How fast is really fast? All right, 24, 26, 28 knots. The fastest I got this was 31.4 knots, according to my GPS. And I felt quite in control during that. But what it doesn't allow is recovery. If you do make a mistake, the crash is really fast, because again, if you hit a bit of a bump, like a bit of cross current or something, and you're leaning slightly too far forward, it's down straight away at those speeds. It's really hard to recover. Where, for example, if we're used to, like Steve, you know about it, on a race foil, you have a certain amount of resistance to it pitching forward or up at those speeds. It actually becomes like super hyper stable. Where I find that the Triton becomes quite loose. It's actually loose is the wrong word. It feels like it's on rails when it's going straight, but when you make a mistake, it reacts so fast to your screw up essentially that you have almost no chance of recovering once you go over 25 knots, in my opinion. Jim Dolan saying, yep, the Triton's website saying they're planning on coming out with a wing version. Yes, Chris did tell me that, yep, that they're working on something like that, and I'm really looking forward to trying that out because it's going to be really interesting for that market. So yeah, I've heard that's probably going to be a little bit different than the T1. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to seeing what they come up with. Right. So I also had a few people asking me, so what are a few tips when you're just starting out with the T1? So if you're a proficient foiler, my personal opinion, you don't have to change much. The first initial part, I would say, go actually strapless, just to figure out in the beginning where to put the foil so that it's in the right place. Once you figure that out and you've got that sorted out, if you want to use straps, I would actually start using straps as soon as you can. It'll just sort of help you with that sort of foot placement during maneuvers and also just during the water start and so on. So you don't have to sort of figure it out too much on the water. It'll just add that little bit more stability and more comfort for you. Later on, when you are riding strapless, it's also not a problem once you've got the timing for it. When you're starting, like, I mean, water starting, not starting out, don't do things too much differently, but don't force it. I found what the T1 doesn't like is if you kick it really hard, like to try to get up, especially in light winds, it'll just rise up really quick. And then if you're not ready for it, you're pushing too hard on the nose because you're, oh my God, I'm going to try to recover that. And you'll start dolphining, and it's not something you're used to. Try to get a little bit more board speed, bear off a little bit downwind. Just try to let the foil do the work for you and then get up. Another tip is here, go for a bit of a wider stance. The wider stance seems to make it a bit easier to balance and control the foil. Now, when you're getting into like approaching your first jibe, the best advice I can give you just go for it. And even if it feels a bit wobbly, just push through the jibe. It can do it. The main problem I always find in the beginning with this foil, like if I've been writing something else for a while, my trust level is slightly like off, and then I'll be like, oh, it's wobbling, and then I'll get afraid and I'll crash. But then on the second jibe, I'm like, just go through it. As long as you're actually committed to the maneuver and quite forceful, especially sort of you riding more off your back foot when you're doing that, you can actually recover quite easily from most of those maneuvers. All right, good morning, asking, how is it possible to go so fast with such a thick profile? What is the purpose of this foil? All right, that's two questions in one. So how is it possible to go so fast with such a thick profile? Physics. Now, this is one of the sort of misconceptions that a thick profile is automatically not capable of going fast. You can basically say a thick profile is not efficient. That's always true. However, the shape of the profile, all the other factors like chord and aspect ratio and all those things, they all also count into that. Now, especially with kites, we can compensate quite a lot for, say, lack of efficiency, and we can still make things go fast. So as long as we have power, the amount of resistance from the thickness of the profile is it's not gonna cause a massive difference. If you look at sort of most of the math, like sort of your drag coefficient equations, you'll see that the thickness of the foil doesn't actually scale as much. But another thing is, it's actually not that massively thick. So if you look at it here, I mean, it looks sort of very thick, but actually a lot of the thickness is going out towards the tip and are actually adding to that stability. But as long as you have the power, it can go fast. And the thing is, I've won races, for example, on the Balls Pro, which is it's a fairly thick profiled freestyle foil. And I was still beating people on much thinner profile foils too. So speed, especially when it comes to wind powered sports, it's actually more important of how much power can you hold. So with kites, I mean, most of the racers can attest to this. It's nice to make the foil more efficient. It's better upwind, but for straight and speed, the thickness of your profile, it's not gonna matter all too much. All right. Okay. Another question. Yeah. Again, people were asking, why is the wingtip such a funny shape with this weird kick there? This is essentially what makes a monofoil, or sort of, like the stealth bomber, work. Reflex. So by having quite a lot of reflex here in the tips on both sides, and also just in general along the profile, you have this automatic sort of recovery from sort of a downward pitching moment. You'll actually notice almost all the modern foil kites have reflex in their profiles. Some tube kites actually do too, and this helps for quite a good stability, especially when you're quite sheeted out. On a foil kite, you'll actually see that the brakes, when they're disengaged, will actually flare up and allow the kite to remain sort of stable in a depowered state quite far forward in the window. And that's the exact sort of same thing what's happening here on a monofoil, is that reflex on the back of it is actually acting like a stabilizer, and it's keeping the wing pitch stable. Now, I've talked a lot about the pros of a monofoil, or essentially all stabless foils too. Now, Steve is asking one more question. What size were you on when you reached 31 knots, and what was the wind speed? I was on my 7 meter. I can talk about it now. My 7 meter code 0, one strut from north, on 10 meter lines, and it was, I'd say, about 18-20 knots of wind, typical sort of Flag Beach summer conditions. It was fairly flat water, but choppy. You know what Flag Beach is like, Steve. So what was I actually just talking about? Oh yeah, so pros and cons. So the pros we've talked to quite a lot, but just to recap, really tight and fast turning. It's sort of really fast for its size. You have less packing stuff to worry about. It's lighter than most foils. Um, yeah, and it's just in general. I know I say this a lot. It's really fun to ride a foil like this. It's very reactive. It, yeah, it's like riding a really small foil while still having the low end of. So I would tend to say for kite foiling, it'd basically be like taking like a sap foil 633, having that low end, but having the turnability of the 740 high aspect um, race foil on a short fuselage with a very small stabilizer. So it has that low end with super tight turning. Now, what, and essentially that's what it's for. If you like sort of flat water freestyle, like tight turning in the waves and so on, um, it's great for that. What it isn't quite good at is, for example, glide efficiency. It's not going to be a dock starting, pumping foil. Yeah. So for winging, essentially, a lot of the things that people like about winging, where you can basically disengage the wing and pump and stuff like that, it's not quite the foil for that. If you're hoping to, kick away your wing and then sort of pump after, I mean, kick away your kite and then pump after it, it's not going to happen with this. Um, are you going to win any races on this? No, you're not. It's not that type of foil. Um, Now, the other thing, again, maneuvers are slightly more difficult. They demand a more precise steering and a more committed steering. So I would tend to say if you're learning maneuvers, I would say this is not the foil to learn maneuvers on. It's not that forgiving. But if you do learn maneuvers on this, when you go to a normal foil, it's really easy on a normal foil to switch your feet during a jibe or to do a 360 and everything. Um, this sort of forces you to do it right and right immediately. It won't forgive any wrong foot placement or any sort of bad positioning of the kite. Um, so yeah, so that agility that makes it really fun is not going to work really well for somebody who's just learning their first jibes, their first foot switches, etc., etc. And again, this is the same thing for winging. It's not for somebody who's going to um, who's doing their first times on the wing and their first maneuvers. It's just a little bit too small and a little bit too agile for a rider like that. All right, another question I got from the guys from the kite forum, and again, thanks for everyone who wrote to me, is how is it for wind foiling? And honestly, I haven't been wind foiling with it, but just in general, you'd have to have the foil so far forward. I don't own a wind foil board where I could put this foil on, not with the current geometry they have. Um, I've got two wind foil boards with like a standard sort of tuttle box position, um, and that's way too far back. And I've got one with a like a track position, but that's still too far back, and there's no way I'm getting that up on the wind foil. I'm pretty sure you can, and wind foil gives you just a general extra stability by having the mast fully attached to the board. So I'm assuming it'll work pretty okay for wind foiling. But the fact is, I don't actually have a board I can wind foil with this, so that's not something I have tested. All right. Well, we've almost done an hour now, so I think I've covered almost everything on here. So if you don't have any more questions, I will just sort of recap on, well, what is this foil for? What is it really fun? Am I going to keep riding it? Yes, there's things on this foil that no other foil can do. Those really tight turnings. The next trick I really want to learn on this is something that's basically impossible on a normal foil. I want to be able to do like a 720 flat sort of sliding spin on the kite. So stay tuned when I actually do land it and have it on camera. I'm probably gonna post it immediately. So I'll be so stoked. I can sort of do like I can do it now on this with just the standard 360, but I want to be able to do like a 720 with the kite parked and just sliding the foil on the surface of the water. That is something that is impossible on any other foil, and I really want to continue riding this foil to be able to work on that. And I also want to, as our winter season comes in, I want to actually see if I can surf foil with it, and if I can essentially do some proper kite foil wave riding with it in some larger, steeper, like point break waves, which we get in the winter season. All right, Alan, listen, sorry if I butchered your name there. What are my favorite conditions for it? For all those slidey tricks and so on, pretty much flat water, like anything between 10, 15 knots in flat water with like a 7 meter, 8 meter kite. It's awesome for that. If for waves, I really like I said, small to shoulder high waves, sort of just not quite, breaking hollow, just enough for that. It's really fun to play in those type of waves there. Oh, one thing I haven't covered. I mean, we saw in the video jumping. I mean, it's great jumping because you have that speed. Now, however, the problem is it has quite a lot of surface area in that respect. So when jumping, it takes a little bit more sort of force to release, I found. And then landing, yes, it's got quite a lot of area. And yeah, you have to land properly to land well. I think in the video there were like 1 or 2 crashes. And the other thing is because it's so sensitive to your front foot, if you land with a bit too much front foot pressure, you will nosedive, especially short board like mine, you will nosedive it quite easily. The good part of it, because it reacts quite nice to your inputs, if you do nosedive, it's quite easy to recover it back up. But it's not quite as easy if, for example, if you're jumping with like a small, like a 550, 650, high aspect, mid aspect glider foil, which doesn't have so much surface area. It's a lot easier to sort of dive that into the water than the T1 is, because you look at it, it's quite a substantial flat area. So if you come down flat, you're probably not going to land it super well. Okay. Right. So if that's it, I would like to thank everybody who has joined the live cast today. I hope I answered most everybody's questions on the foil. And I hope the people who have ordered one already and are just about to receive it and go for the first rides, that are giving them a few tips that will make it just easier to get used to. And yeah, I look forward to getting this out on the water and basically doing exceptionally amazing, cool tricks that I can't do on any of the other foils. Okay. If you would like to support the channel a little bit more, there is a link to my Buy My Coffee page in the description. That's sort of a quick and easy way to just show your support for the channel and just to support my caffeine addiction. It helps me get on the water in the mornings. And I will talk to you guys on Monday, because there I will be talking about the new North MA foils. All right. And then also stay tuned. I will be launching the new hydrofoil.w2f channel sometime in the next few weeks. There's going to be a lot of more technical things on there. For example, how to tune your foil, some just general tips on how to build boards, how to build foils, what to look out for, and then also some sort of technical riding tricks. So if there's any topics you would like to talk about that are a lot more sort of technical, that's what that channel is going to be for. So if you guys have some ideas, just either drop me an email or a private message on Facebook or Instagram, and I will consider making that video. All right. Thanks for watching, guys. It's been awesome. Enjoy your time on the water. Rock on.